Well, I was born in September 1930 in Rusholme, and in those days, as far as I know, if you could afford it, you went into a little nursing home, and I was born there, and we lived in Didsbury. But very soon, my father moved, and we went to live in Matlock for a while, and then to Ulverston in Lancashire. And that's where I first went to school. A little primary school called Bardsey, because it was on Bardsey Bay. I don't suppose it's there now. And we used to have to take our dinner. And the teacher, makes me smile because I was a teacher, the teacher, if I took an egg, would boil the egg for me. I'd have my bread and butter and she'd boil the egg. And sometimes it was sandwiches, but we always had to take our own dinner because we were too far to go home. And we left there when I was 7. And my father, we went to Brickhouse in Yorkshire, which strangely enough was where my mother had come from. So we were all busy doing circles and going back. And we lived there from when I was 7 until I went away to be a student. And so I spent the war years in Brickhouse. I went to primary school, to Carl Green County Primary School. And in those days, you had to sit for the scholarship. And I was the only girl that got a scholarship. There was me and there were 2 boys. And they went to the boys' school, because there were no mixed grammar schools in Brickhouse at that time. I went to Brickhouse Girls' Grammar School, which was a 2-form entry, and it was very sort of itsy-bitsy and a bit ladylike. And well, in those days, you hadn't to speak at the change of lessons as you walked along the corridor in a single file, and nobody spoke. And eventually, many years later, when I became head girl, I reformed the place, and I thought that it was very regimented and didn't give the girls any credit for having any common sense, etc. And I negotiated with the head. She was a headmistress, very much so a headmistress. I negotiated with her that as long as we were civilised, we didn't necessarily have to walk like soldiers in straight lines, and we were allowed, if necessary, just to speak, as long as we were like ladies. So that was probably my first move into reforming things. And then I went away. I went to, this was 1948, when the soldiers were still returning from the war. We had very few universities, and soldiers were taken out of the places. So there were not many places for kids from school. And I had a place at Manchester to read history. But, and this is absolutely unheard of, when the exams were late then, now they're very early, they were late. And of all things, me that's never ill, I had tonsillitis and quinses. And so I couldn't take what in those days were higher school certificate. So I didn't take them. Now, because I was very young, the school said, and the university said, my birthday was September, and in those days, the date for change was the 1st of October, not the 1st of September. So I was very, very young. Wherever I was always the youngest in the class or the group. And the university and the school said, well, she's very young, but she'll only be the 18 when she goes again next year, so stay at school another year. But my father wouldn't have that, so I went to what was then a training college. And I went for 2 years to train to be a teacher. I was very cross as the years went on, because I did write to what was then the department, I think it was the Department for Education and Science, the DES. And I did say, I've had 2 years, in those days it was free, 2 years free post-18 education. May I have the other two that I would have had if I'd done 3 years for a degree and a year for the teacher training. May I have those other 2 years? And I'll pay for a year myself because I want to go and do my degree. And they wouldn't have it. So I've always been resentful about that. But because I'm me, I decided eventually that I should do a degree. So I did my degree part-time. I got a husband, 2 kids and a full-time job, but I did my degree. And I went to Lancaster. The outpost was Chorley. I went 2 nights a week to Chorley and some residential in the holidays, and I did my degree that way. And eventually, when I was 44, I got my degree, but presented at Lancaster by Princess Alexandra. And she said to me, by this time I'd just got a headship, and which is that's another side to the story, because I'm not very good with little children. I wasn't all that good with my own little children, but adolescents are my forte, and I love adolescents, and I always worked in the secondary field, and you perhaps don't want to know this story at the moment, but it's quite an interesting story how I eventually I went back to work part-time. The interesting bit here perhaps is that when I first started work in 1950, I got £20 a month. Well, in 1956 I had my first baby, and so I was out. I didn't go to school. I didn't work for 3 years. Then I had another child, and then I did part-time. And when I went part-time, things had really progressed because I got what was £5 a week, £20 a month, exactly as much as I'd had full-time when I started. I got £20 a month for doing part-time. And when my children had, of course, being my children, they would be awkward, they had measles, not together, but for 2 weeks and then 2 weeks. So I paid my £5, which was £1 a day, a morning, to a lady who came and stayed with my children so I could go to school and keep going. I became senior mistress in a mixed school, and a bit funny because the head teacher, a man, of course, he'd been a captain, I think, in the war, and he was very captain physically orientated, and in company at school and at meetings, he would always introduce me as my senior mistress, which amused people, and so when and then because of educational change, this was always in Salford. I've always worked and taught all my life in Salford, and when there was some reorganisation and the school I was working in was closed, the kids and teachers were sent to other places, and I went to Hope High School, and I worked there, and I started, one of the things I started was in school was careers guidance, which was really quite bizarre at that time. We had youth employment officers, and I worked with youth employment officer, and I was one of the first members of the National Association of Careers and Guidance Teachers, and I used to go to conferences and all sorts of things.
What year was that?
I can give you the year exactly. Let me just work it out. 70, about 70.
Yeah.
68, 70.
Yes. What I'd like to do, if I may, because we've come away from the war, so
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's all right, because we can come back, and we can come back to what you were saying a bit later on. But
go back to the war.
Yes. What do you remember, if anything, about the advent of war and the outbreak? Do you have any?
I
sort
do.
of memories?
Yes, I remember very clearly the nervous alarm. Because remember, I was a little girl. I was 8 in 1938 when Chamberlain went to Munich, and I remember something about the nervous anxiety of my parents. So I was an only child,
Yes.
and I just remember the sort of nervousness and perhaps relief that wasn't relief. And I remember 1939 very clearly, because it was a very hot summer, and we had no fire. Because we had coal fires in the grate, and we had no fire. And I remember the outbreak of the war. I remember the horror when, and I can hear, as I'm talking to you now, I can hear Chamberlain saying, "I have to tell you, we have had no response, and therefore we are at war with Germany." You can remember that.
Yes.
Quite clearly.
Yes.
I can hear him. And then there was this sort of quiet period when, of course, as a child, I didn't know. I didn't know what was going on. But my father worked at that point. He worked for the wool control in Bradford, and the wool control was immediately evacuated to Ilkley. So my father and all the people's cars, ordinary people couldn't have petrol and cars, so my father had to live in Ilkley from Monday to Saturday. He came home Saturday lunchtime and went Monday morning. Somebody who was allowed a car to collect these people went, and that's what happened. So my mother and I were on our own. And when I think probably the next thing to tell you is about Dunkirk. I remember Dunkirk as though it was last night, because hot summer again, everybody out in the road, talking, the neighbours talking and worrying. People who had soldiers there, family, sons, and one day, I'm not sure which day it was, I can't remember, but my mother, because she had a child under, I was 9, I was nearly 9, because this was in May 1939, May and June.
Yes.
This is May and June.
That would be before the outbreak of war.
No, no, sorry, it was 1940.
Yes, that's
right.
better.
1940, yes. May and June 1940, Dunkirk. And so I was not 10 until the September, so it was just before I was 10. And my mother, because she had a young child, only had to do part-time work. So she went and worked doing dinners in a local school. She was a dinner assistant in a local school. And the loudspeakers came round the streets. There was a lot of information imparted by loudspeakers. And she had, all the women had to go to the Sunday schools. And this particular Sunday school, because there was a train bringing soldiers from Dunkirk. We'd been hearing the news. We knew terrible things were happening. And we knew that they were having to evacuate the soldiers, and there was a train coming. Well, we knew in school, I don't quite know how we knew in school, but when I left school in the afternoon, I went to the Sunday school where my mother was, and the train had brought these soldiers, battle-scarred, in blankets, and very, very, some of them very distressed. And they'd put them on lorries at the station, and they'd taken them to this centre, which was opened. It was the Sunday school centre, where, from somewhere, had come tables and chairs, and urns and food and equipment. And along the trestle tables along the wall, they put underpants and vests and trousers and things, and there were people there. And the soldiers were fed and watered, and then they had to go along this row and collect their equipment. They were given kit bags and they collect all their equipment. Then they had to get onto the lorries, by which time the women who were doing the meals and seeing to them, because they were army people doing the giving out the equipment, the women were told to go home. And I went home with my mother, and soon the lorry came in the road, and the officer came to the door and he knocked on the door and he said, "How many people live here?" My mother said two, myself and my child. And the officer came in to check the bedrooms and the beds. And then he went out and he said, "Two." And 2 soldiers came. And what they had to do was give them a bath, because they were told to go home and put the heating system. In our case, of course, we had to light a fire to get hot water, because it was about an old-fashioned bat boiler, as it was in those days. And they had to be given a bath. They got their clean clothes to put on, and then my mother had to she'd made a meal. And I think that eventually, I think they were probably paid for the meal, or I think they may have been given food, because remember, we were on strict rations.
Yes.
And these soldiers had the meal, and then I remember sitting on the mat, no fire in the grate, because it was very warm time, and these soldiers telling us how the Germans dive-bombed them on the beaches, how they were dive-bombed trying to get to the ships, how some of the ships were blown up, and some of the horrible things they had experienced. So that's very clear in my mind. And then we had an evacuee later from London, a little girl called Elizabeth Kirby. And we looked after her, and I took her to school. And one weekend, her parents came up to see her, and they just had a carrier bag. They didn't have a suitcase or anything, they had a carrier bag. And I don't think they had much in the way of the sort of things we would take if we were going away for the weekend. And they wanted to go out and take her out. So, of course, my mother couldn't say no, so they took her out. But a neighbour later told us that this little girl was sitting on the doorstep of the pub down the hill, and the parents were inside, because in those days apparently you couldn't take a small child in. Anyway, we had her for several years during the war till she went home. Other things I remember about the war, although we were fairly safe in Brig House, there were a lot of raids on Bradford, and we used to sleep. We had a big square table, and we used to sleep, my mother and I and this child, under the table. We used to put the mattress and the eiderdown and everything. We had an eiderdown, no duvets then. We had blankets and an eiderdown.
Yes.
And we slept under the table when there was a raid on.
Was that a special table or just...
No, it was our dining table. We had a big square dining table, and we had to get underneath. And do as we were told. Then what else do I remember about the war? I remember at school, by this time I was at the grammar school. We had adjacent to the school, the land rose, and in there they dug some tunnels, and they put seats along each side of this rather horrible tunnel, and there were some lights. And when there was a daylight raid in Bradford, which very occasionally, not very often, we had to go, and we had our lessons sitting in this tunnel. Remember that? Then eventually I remember D-Day. And I can see it. I was in a Latin class, and the school secretary, we had a secretary of the school, she came round and she just knocked on the door, opened the door, she said, this must have been about 10 o'clock on the morning of the 6th of June. And she said, they've landed, it's started. So we were all excited. And then soon after that, I remember being at home because nobody really had telephones, and communication was by telegraph boys, young boys who'd recently left school on bicycles being sent, and it was a very yellow envelope with the message in. And I remember the boy coming to the house next door. His name was the airman. He was an airman that lived there with his mother, and he was called Harold King, and he was a pilot. He was only very young. I don't know what he was flying, but this telegram came to say he'd been killed in action, and I can hear the mother screaming. It was horrible. And lots of other people that we knew lost relatives and husbands, fathers and things. One thing I remember about the rationing, because I had a green ration book, so that was very special. And if there was a shipload of bananas had come, then it went round the town like wildfire. I don't know how everybody knew, but you know about the grapevine. And there were bananas. So, for green books only. So I think babies were blue. Children above toddlers to perhaps, would it be 14 or 15? It was green. And then the adults had a buff-coloured one. So green ration books could have bananas. So my mother and all the other women literally ran. Now, we lived up a hill. So she ran, she had to go all down the hill, down Huddersfield Road, into the town, to where there was a greengrocer's and where they'd got the bananas. And she got in this queue, tremendous queue. And she was 3 hours in that queue, and she got 2 bananas.
Oh dear.
Right? But that was wonderful. Because when I came home from school, there were 2 bananas. Well, a banana in those days was a meal. So I had a banana and some bread and butter, and that was my meal. And later that night, and it's quite strange that the way this happened, later that night, my mother went to the missionary, what they call it, the London Missionary Society, I think, and they used to meet once a week in somebody's house, and they were knitting, and they were knitting 6-inch squares, which one of them then sewed together, and those were, I never knew a soldier who had one, but they spent hours knitting squares to make blankets for soldiers. And my mother was going round the corner to this house, and when I'd done my homework, although there was blackout, it was only round the corner, so I went to meet her and walk home with her, because that was my little bit of exercise. And when I got there, knocked on the door, was let in. I went in, and there on the sideboard, there was a fruit bowl with a hand of bananas in. Well, I looked at this and I said, bananas! And the lady of the house, who was the wife of the church warden, who had no children, said, "We know the greengrocer." And that was my very first moment of questioning people who are religious. But these were the people who ran the church. These were the people who told us what was good and how we should behave. And my mother had queued for 3 hours to get 2 bananas on my ration book. And this woman with no children had, I seem to remember there were 6. How could it be? But the stupid woman hadn't had the common sense to leave them in the... So, I know we're not here for me to tell you my other experiences of things that shook me and made me sit back and question. But there have been things at stages in my life that made me question. Anyway, so that was the bananas, that was the rationing. How did we eat? Well, to start with, we dug up the lawn and we grew potatoes and we grew various bits of things. And one of the things that my mother and I did, because remembering we'd no plastic bags or anything, we only had paper bags that we put things in, and a wicker basket. You did your shopping with your wicker basket. Now, once a week, my mother and I, we had some big gloves, and we lived quite near to Bradley Wood. Anybody who's watching this and lives in Huddersfield or Brighouse, they will know Bradley Wood. And if you're going on the motorway, the 62, and you're going down the hill from Brighouse, go right down to the river, the Calder, right down to the river, and up the other side towards Leeds. All on that left side is the Bradley Woods, although if they're still there, they were Bradley Woods. My mother and I, we went there with this big wicker basket, and guess what we collected? Nettles. And we came home with a great big basket of nettles, which we washed and we shoved in a pan and pushed it down as it boiled, and it was just like spinach. And we had that with bread and butter, and that was a meal once a week. And I always say, when people say, "Good God, woman," I say, that's why I'm so beautiful. It's all that vitamin C and all that green chlorophyll that I got from the nettles. So that was one thing we had. Another thing, we had stuffing. Everybody knows how to make stuffing. You tear up the bread, chop the onion and put some sage in and pop it down and shove it in the fat in the hot oven. Well, we did that, but if we were lucky, we had an egg. As a child, most weeks I had one egg. Many weeks, my mother didn't have any egg at all. Sometimes they were lucky and they got an egg. But there was a stuff called dried egg that came from America in a tin, which they mixed. And you could make omelettes and things with it. And we did. But this one egg of mine would go into the big dish of the stuffing that was made. And one egg, and of course, remember, bread was rationed as well. One egg and the bread and the onion and the sage mixed all up into the hot fat in the oven and all crisped up and lovely and crispy. And we had that with an OXO cube, and that was another meal. And we had a thing that I don't know why we called it decent, and it was small pieces of potato boiled up with an onion, and when they were cooked, the water was drained off, most of it, and a little milk added, and corn flour or flour, some sort of thickening, and then we had 2 ounces of butter a week. So we had this potato and onion and bit of thickening in a bowl, and we'd have a little knob of butter put on it, and we'd watch it melt into this, and that was another meal. And that's how we lived. And that's one reason why and when I was poor, when I was first married and so on, and we lived on things like sheep's heads. Sheep's head was 8p. Chop it in two, take out the brains, put them in a Pyrex dish with a little milk over a pan of boiling water, and that did the baby twice with a bit of mashed up carrot. The head, I washed it in the washing up bowl in some salty water, and then I put it in the pressure cooker, and with a bit of with some lentils and barley and onion and carrot, and I did it in the pressure cooker, and then I took out the tongue and the cheeks, and I made potted meat, and that potted meat with some bread and butter did my husband and myself for tea. The next day, I parted with the skull, but the soup I put dumplings in, and that was a meal. And you see, look at me. All these years on, 70 or more years on, and I'm not fat, and I must be fairly healthy. And that's how we ate when I was a child and a teenager and into my early married life. So I become a little bit impatient with how people can't always manage their money. You know, I know how to do without, because we had to do without. Our clothes, I know how to turn a sheet, because you couldn't buy sheets really. You had coupons and you could have so many clothes, and there weren't many clothes to buy anyway. But right until long into my married life, I would take a sheet, I presume they were cotton in those days, cut it in the middle and sides to middle it. And it did another couple of years.
I doubt that many people will remember that, actually.
No, well, I did that.
Just coming back to the end of the war, what do you remember of VE Day?
Right. Well, I remember that everybody was out in the street, in the road. I lived on Daisy Road, up the hill. And everybody was out cheering and clapping and so on. And we listened to the radio, because in those days we didn't have a television in 1945. So we listened to the radio. And in those days we went to the pictures. We went to pictures every week. We walked all the way down the hill and across the river into the town to the cinema. And we went and watched what was going on from the newsreels, the big newsreels. Tell you something else I've just remembered. We had collecting a big thermometer in the town square to show how much money we'd collected. And we'd be doing for submarines. And we collected for a submarine and towards a battleship, and there were those ongoing efforts. On V Day, we the celebrations were more the people in the road, the radio, and listening to the radio, and then running out and telling people what we just heard. Have you heard? And all this business, talking to the neighbours, and then we all went to the pictures, because we wanted to see the newsreels to see what was going on, because that's the only way we could do it. We did actually get we did actually get a television in 1947 for the Queen's wedding, and we got this little black and white television in the corner, and we moved the furniture, and we got all the stools, and all the neighbours came and watched the wedding in our house. Remember that? But I don't remember much else about VE Day except the euphoria and the relief, and being in the road with the people, with the neighbours, and this continual running to the pictures to see the newsreels.
Did VJ? Excuse me.
Oh, I can tell you about VJ Day. Yes. Well, VJ Day, that was in August. That was a few weeks, May, June, July, August, 3 or 4 months later. 6th of August. We used to go to Southport for a week for holiday, and we stayed in a boarding house where probably people today will be surprised to hear this. The ladies supplied the breakfast, and it would be something quite simple, like because we had to take rations. We had to take things. She couldn't supply much. But my mother would then go to the shops to try and buy something which the lady would then cook for our lunch. And our tea would be something simple like beans on toast. And one of the things that I did because I hadn't got a bicycle, and everybody else had a bicycle. This was probably coming after the war, and so I saved my pocket money, and I think it was sixpence for the hour, and I went and hired a bike and I rode about, and I had to walk down the pier, Southport Pier. Anybody who knows it, I had to walk down Southport Pier, and I had to pretend I had a book on my head, and I had to walk along the plank. And to my mother, for making me do that, I'm grateful, because that gave me the beginnings of what I have been advantageous for me in my career. You know, so that VJ Day, we were in Southport, and my mother and I don't know where my father was. He wasn't there, but my mother and I were in the floral gardens. People who watch this will probably know the floral gardens. We're in there listening to the band, and my mother could hear about 4 o'clock. My mother could hear the paper boy shouting, as they used to. They used to walk along the front shouting, "Paper, paper!" And so my mother gave me some money. It'd only be coppers, wouldn't it then? And told me to go and get a paper. So I did. And he was shouting that the war was over. Japan had surrendered. And I brought this paper back. Japan, I can see it, Japan surrenders. And I brought it back to him. I said, look, what's happened? And she said to me, right, go and stand under where the platform, where the conductor was. She said, and when he's finished this piece, poke his leg and give him this. So I did that, and I poked his leg and I gave it to him. And he, on his microphone, told and announced that, and he read it to the people. So that was that was my part in the armistice for when Japan was finished. I don't suppose probably now is you'll have people who will tell you about what happened, but I do remember quite a lot of the stories that people told when they came home about particularly about the cruelty of the Japanese.
I mean, one of the concerns, I think, was that people who had been captured by the Japanese didn't come back in a terribly good state.
No. Well, because I was only a child, and they kept these people away from us. But I do know that somebody down the road, he couldn't work and he couldn't anything. He was, I suppose today we would call it traumatised, would we?
Probably, yes.
And he never recovered from that. It was the mental shock, mental illness perhaps, worse than the physical things.
Yes.
Yes, so that was sort of there. But at that point, the war was over. We had to get on with it. We had to put the world right. And I remember things. I remember when Roosevelt died. I remember the meeting with the Russians in the Ukraine, the Crimea.
Yes.
They went and met. Remember that, because we heard it on the news, but we always had to go. So it's difficult for people today because they see everything.
Yes.
But the only way we could see anything was to go to the pictures, which we did. And I remember the founding of the United Nations. And by this time, this was 1950, I think. I was doing my final exams. I think this is probably quite interesting, because I was doing my final exams, and apart from all the education and the teaching things, which was amazing, we were amazingly taught how to be a teacher, how to manage a classroom. And as the years went on, and I received students from Manchester University in my school when I was head teacher, I couldn't believe they didn't know the basic mechanics. They hadn't been taught the basic mechanics of classroom management. However, I'd done all that, and I'd done history, geography, politics, and economics. And it must have been my history paper. And the question was, because they were planning the United Nations. Or the United Nations was in, I know, it was operable by then. They'd planned it and got it going. But the question was, what chance is there of the United Nations doing better and being more effective at keeping world peace than the League of Nations? That was the question. And this was 1950. What was it? June, July? And I remember quite clearly, because we talked about this, that unless the United Nations had a physical force to force a recalcitrant country to come into line, it would fail like the League of Nations had failed. Now, between me writing that and it being marked, North Korea invaded South Korea. So it was very pertinent to what was going on. Yes, because the United Nations was formed straight after the war, of course. But this was its first real test in 1950. And I think that was soon after that when my neighbour was in Korea and Hong Kong. Right. So that was perhaps quite telling, particularly as to what's happening today.
Yes.
Because we're all talk. We're all what my grandma would say. We're all piss and puff. There's no, and it's very difficult. But unless there's some force to make an invader do as they're told, or stop bombing, or do this, if we've no force, it's not a lot of use.
In a way, I guess you're probably saying that history tends to repeat itself to an extent.
Sadly, yeah. But you see, if we're talking about history, because I read history, if we're talking about history, somebody should have told Hitler about history, because the thing that finished off Napoleon, really, was his Russian campaign.
Yes.
And if Hitler had studied history, he would have known better than to go to Russia in the way he did. Because that was really what was his death knell. Since those times, I had been to Russia. I went to St. Petersburg. I went to St. Petersburg in 1970. This may be interesting. In 1979. Now the Russians went into Afghanistan in January, and in February half term, I was planned and booked to take 30 children to Russia, to St. Petersburg and Moscow for a week. So this terrible thing happened in January, and I thought, oh. So I got onto the education office and I said to the senior inspector, will it be safe for me to go to Russia with the children? And they said, well, it'd be a good idea if you had a meeting with the parents. So I called a meeting of the parents, and because from the news, by this time we'd all got tellies and so everybody knew what was going on. Would it be a good idea to go to, had I better, call this off? And the parents, like one person says, oh, they'll be all right with you. I thought, right. So I got onto the, wherever you get passports from, the Foreign Office, and I got, instead of them all having their own passport, I got a communal passport So I would carry the lot, just in case. So I prepared them as best I could for what we were going to, because I wouldn't go anywhere anyway without preparing them. And everybody was all keen and very excited that they were going to Russia. But I knew that in the sixth form college, I knew the vice principal who actually taught and spoke Russian. So I asked him to come with me. So it was me and him, and I had two male members of staff. And as a condition on him coming with me, he wanted 6 of his top students with him, Russian speakers. So that was fine. So we're all ready, and we had a few Russian lessons, and we could say "Do svidaniya" and all these sort of things. And we went. Now, this was February. We flew to Russia via Helsinki, and in a snowstorm. And I never thought the plane would get up. We had to land because people getting on there. I thought anyway, we got to St. Petersburg, and I had the passports and I had the money. And as we went through, they were very nasty with us, and they wouldn't let me through with all this money. So all the kids had to come back. I had to give them all some money. They went through, I went through, and then they all gave me the money back. That was how silly it was. Lots of silly things like that happened to us. We were conscious that there would probably be some surveillance in the rooms. Kids were all lectured and threatened by me. And it was interesting that at the end of the corridor on which our rooms were, there was a table with a Russian lady, a big Russian lady sitting, and she had a television screen. So every night at 6 o'clock, we went and we watched what was going on because it was showing about the war. Now, we couldn't understand it, of course, because it was in Russian, but we could see and learn. Now, that was where, in Russia at that time, I learned not to have milk in my tea because they only had what we used to call sterilised milk because it was winter and there were no cows and there was no transport bringing milk in. And it was this horrendous, sterilised milk you used to buy to make milk puddings, makes fabulous rice pudding, and you can't get it now. But I didn't like it in tea. So I began to drink my tea without milk, and I've never had it in tea or coffee since. The food was abysmal, even by my standards that can manage on anything. We had soup, which was water, which had cabbage leaves in, and so on. And I had the presence of mind, I can't remember quite how or why, it's a long time ago, but I took with me and they let me in with it, strangely, without crossing out. I took a big bag of all brown, brown. I took this brown, and every night I put a good spoonful of this brown into this horrible water flavoured by cabbage leaf, and I ate it. And of course the kids said to me, "What are you doing, miss? What's that?" And I said, "Well, I'm having this just to make sure I'm not constipated." And they all, they all laughed, you see. But as the week went on, they were saying, because there was no fruit or anything, no proper vegetables, and I'd taken some chocolate to help to dole out. But as the week went on, they were saying, "Hey, miss, can I have a spoonful of your stuff?" So I was the doler out of bran towards the end. Plus, what else did we do? I tell you what we did. Now, this is interesting. In St. Petersburg, the square, and the St. Isaac's Cathedral. And opposite, there was the square, and opposite there was either a town hall or some official building with wasn't a clock, it was the temperature.
Mm-hmm.
And it showed the temperature and how low it was. We were well below freezing. And we went in. We had of course a guide, because it was all arranged, and we had the guide and the Russian, and we went in buses to where we had to be. And in fact, one day I said to the driver, and this may not be very accurate now after all these years, but I said, as I remember, said "Kak vasavut," which I thought was how are you? How do you do? How are you? And he nearly ran his bus into us because this English woman had actually said something to him, and startled him. Anyway, we went into St Isaac's Cathedral, and if ever anybody who's watching this has the opportunity, go there and check if this is still there. Do you know what Fouquet's pendulum is?
Yes.
Yeah, well, Fouquet's pendulum hangs from the ceiling very high down to the floor. And on the floor, there's the north, south, east and west set out as a... and I think in St Isaac's it was in tiles. And the pendulum is swinging. And as the pendulum swings, it continues to swing in its own path. And it looks to be moving round because it's showing how we are moving and the earth is moving, because it's not swinging straight north to south, it begins to swing differently. But that's not moving, we are moving. And that is the most wonderful experience for kids to learn that the world is indeed turning.
Yes.
And actually, there was one in the Buell Hill Mansion in Buell Park. There was one there hanging because it was a lovely entrance hall with a beautiful spiral staircase, and they had a Fouquet's pendulum there.
If I remember rightly, there's one in the Science Museum as well.
Yes.
I think, if I remember rightly.
Yeah. So and other things we did in Russia, we stayed in the Russia Hotel, and many years later, I was on a cruise and I went back there, all posh hotel, posh done up. Now that was the hotel where Hitler had planned his triumphal banquet when Russia had collapsed. And in that hotel, in 1979, that was a long time after the war, but it was still there, there was a display case which had, like a pyramid, two sides, with the glass and the things displayed, and on the bottom the things displayed. And it was the menus, the invitations, and everything that was planned for this great banquet, which was going to be held in the Russia Hotel. Now, I couldn't believe that when I went back in the late 90s, more than 20 years later, nobody in the hotel knew anything about it. And I think that's very, very sad.
Yes.
Surely nobody's destroyed that. Because, of course, he never did conquer Russia, and all those things that he got prepared were never able to be used. So they're the most amazing historical documents, and some idiot lost them. But I had seen them.
Can we just go back? I think we're probably coming towards the end of the interview now, but just one thing that I wanted to ask you, you probably alluded to it earlier, but was your father in the First World War?
In the First War, not the
Yes.
Second.
Yes.
Yes, my father and his brother, there were four of them, a father, brother and two sisters. And of course, if I tell you about them, you see the tragedy of the amazing death toll, because although it was only 4 years, as opposed to 6 for the Second War, we lost more men. And the women who were at home, there were no men to marry, and we had all this vast, thousands and thousands of old maid spinsters, of which my two aunts, they were two. My father was in the war, and he was injured. He had a leg injury which troubled him for all his life, and he would never talk about the war, no matter what I did. Even when I was a history teacher, asking him about it, I couldn't get anything out of him at all, except that he spent his 21st birthday in the trenches, and there were 4 of them shared a tin of bully beef. That is the only, and the fact of his wound. I don't know where he got it, what happened to him, except he was taken to a field station and then to the hospital away from the line and then brought home. Now, a different story for his brother, Norman. Norman was in the first wave on the 1st of July 1916, the Battle of the Somme. And he was in the Manchesters. They were right at in the forefront. And he went what was known as over the top. And that's one reason why the current play, Birdsong at the Lowry, well, it was there the other day, shows something about the horrors of the battle of the first day of the Battle of the Somme. And he was killed before Harper's State. And he was just 19. So that was before my time, but I've heard those stories. My grandma, her brothers, she had 2 younger brothers who were considerably younger than her, who were, strangely enough, their children, my grandma's brothers' children, who are really my mother's cousins, are younger than I am. They're all dead, by the way, but they're younger than I am. Those 2 brothers, one was in the I think it was the last cavalry regiment, the last lot of our soldiers who went to war on horseback, and he was wounded and captured, and he was in a prisoner of war camp for, I think, 2 or 3 years. And the other brother had an arm shot off. So that was the toll on our family. 1 killed, 1 wounded with a permanent wound to the leg, 1 lost an arm, and 1 he was gassed. So he was the one that was a prisoner was gassed, and he was always, gasping for breath and an sort of invalid.
Just to, before we finish, thinking back, I mean, you've lived quite a long and interesting life. If you were to give advice today to youngsters as to how they might benefit in the future, what advice would you give them?
Right. Well, that's a hard question. But I would give them advice about money and food and living to start with. Because if you've no money and nowhere to live and no food, you're in a mess. And that's one reason why I don't know, but I am told that in schools today they don't do home economics. Because they should be learning some of the things that I learnt and could do. They should know that if you've only a little bit of money, how you manage it. And one of the things, and I was a head teacher, I became a head teacher, and I'm very proud that I was head teacher of a big mixed school, the first woman in this part of the world to be so. And one of the things that we did budgeting. They learnt to fill in tax forms. We did, you see, I believe that man does not live by bread alone. You have to be trained in order to have a skill to earn your living. And I deplore the fact today that we are concentrating, like blinkers on, for kids to get 10 O-levels and go on to higher education, and then, we've got some, people might not like me saying this, but we have a large number of very second-rate universities and university courses, and the kids end up with second-rate, 10th-rate degrees. In fact, I believe there are some universities at this moment have actually accepted kids unconditionally. That's ridiculous. Because the kids they can't get the jobs. They end up in shops, and shops are closing, and they end up in a mess. While at the same time, we do not have a very strong practical workforce. We do not have enough plumbers, joiners, brickies, electricians, etc. And I'm very proud of a girl that I used to teach who has been in construction in South Africa. She's back home, horrified at what she cannot find for young, white, working class boys. And and there is money to be had. She knows how money, and there's money in philanthropic money. Banks have money for, whatever we say about the banks, they have money. And I'm hoping that she's set out on this course, that she's going to establish some apprentice schools. The Carillion buildings, they're there. There were people who worked with youngsters, and if you think about here, think about Bury, where the army has the recruiting and the disbanding of soldiers. Many of those soldiers have no work. They come here and they're then out of work. But if they're there with skills, I'm hoping that this girl is going to, and she's already working with the people in charge at Bury, to see if she can get them to work with her to train youngsters. And then she needs, and the sad thing is, from my point of view, that I am now, if only I was even 10 years younger, I would ask if schools would let me in so that I could talk to the kids and latch them into this. Because my children in my school, they all did, whether they liked it or not, they did practical work. All my girls went in the workshops, all my boys could sew buttons on. We did all these things. They all went in factories, and they all went in different places of employment. They all did sporting activities, billiards and ice skating. Those are the sort of things that they did. And our exam results were just as good as anybody else's. And they spent 2 afternoons a week doing this. And also, I know you may want to cut this out later, but we also did sex. I was the first school to actually get to grips with the problems that some of the schools had with pregnant girls. I didn't do it, I got experts, but all my kids did a 6-week, one afternoon for 6 weeks with the experts. And soon I had to get the staff to agree, and I get the parents and the chief education officer and so on. I had to get permission because it was a very tricky and dangerous thing to be doing in the mid-70s. But I did it, and within a couple of years, I seldom had a pregnant girl. They were all in the Catholic schools, because the meeting with the chief education officer and the medical officer of health, which we had in those days. Today, one of the sad things is we don't have those people.
No.
And we had a meeting with them to promote this, and of course the Catholic heads wouldn't have it. I think it's probably different now. They've come to terms with it. So that was one thing. And if you're saying to me, what would I say to the children? I'd say those first things I've said. Learn to manage your money. Cut your coat according to your cloth. If you've got £1, only spend 19 pence and 19 shillings and sixpence it used to be.
As it was, yes.
But learn to manage. There are ways to make cheap meals. There are ways to manage. When I was first working as a class teacher, my first job, I had to go, it was 2 bus rides away. And in those days, they were what they called stagers. And I used to walk 2 bus stops to save 1 halfpenny. Right? And if I could do that coming back, I'd save a penny. That was 5p a week. But when you only have £5 a week for everything, your rent, your food, everything, 5p was very valuable. It added up. But that's the brain set I would try to inculcate into kids. It's all right if you've plenty, and if you've plenty of money, be generous with it. But more than that, be generous with your time. Because there are plenty of people today who could be helping others. And one thing I used to do, I used to take children, when I was a class teacher, on journeys to London. And we used to do lots of things, but one of the things we did, we went into St Paul's Cathedral. And in there's a Holman Hunt picture of the Light of the World. And strangely enough, I just saw a bit of the University Challenge this week. And one of the questions, the answer was the Holman Hunt Light of the World. Now that picture, I'm not sure it's still hanging in St Paul's. It used to hang on one of those great big pillars. And I took the kids there, and it's a picture of Christ with trees and birds and bees and things, animals. And underneath, I think I'm right now, it's a long time since I saw it, but I think the caption says, "Any good I can do, let me do it, for I may not pass this way again." Now it's from, I can't remember where it's from in the Bible. Perhaps some clever person can find that. But remember, any good I can do, let me do it, for I may not pass this way again.
Valerie, thank you very much indeed. That's absolutely great.